Would you like to be able to grow more plants in less space in your garden? Would you also like to have fewer weeds and have to water less? Well, there's a planting method that does all of these things for you, and that is what we are talking about today on Hampton Lake Homestead. Today, I'm going to be talking about a style of planting known as intensive or biointensive planting. Today's video will be the first of a 2 or possibly 3-part series that I will do on the topic. I'm going to start today by explaining what the intensive method is and how it's done. Basically, instead of planting in rows, gardens are made into wider grow beds so that more plants can be planted in a smaller area. By planting more plants over a given area, the plants themselves shade the ground, which saves moisture in the soil, and with less light hitting the ground, fewer weeds are able to grow. If you already use Back to Eden or Ruth Stout growing techniques like I do, then you are already improving moisture retention and inhibiting weed growth by adding heavy mulch to the top of the soil. Planting intensively does it even more. Having more roots in the soil also provides a greater secretion of carbon exudates for the microbiota in the soil. Because of the benefit of both techniques, mulch and biointensive planting, I do both. In today's video, I'm going to explain in more detail what the intensive planting method is and how it's done. In the next video, I'll show how it's used practically in my own garden and show some examples of beds that I have already planted this year. So let's dive into intensive planting. We will start discussing intensive planting methods by looking at these 2 grow beds, which are each 5 feet wide and 12 feet long, which corresponds to 60 square growing feet. In the bed on the left, a traditional row system is used, where a row approximately 1 foot wide is planted. Then a space of 3 feet is left for walking between the rows, and then another 1 foot wide bed is planted. With this traditional method, planting a crop with plants 1 foot apart would yield 20 plants in this 160 square foot growing area. The advantage to this system is that there is plenty of room for walking in between the rows to tend to the plants and for harvesting. The disadvantage is that there is more space between rows to weed and less space for growing plants. In the intensive bed on the right, the plants are planted in staggered rows so that plants along the first row are still 1 foot apart, but the difference is that the distance between the plants in the first and second row are still 1 foot apart because they are planted in triangles, where each side is equal or an equilateral triangle. The obvious advantage to this method is that 40 or at least twice the number of plants can be planted in the same growing area. With less wasted space, there is more shade on the growing area, which decreases their need for water and inhibits weed growth. One disadvantage is that there is less walking space, and the gardener stands on either side of the bed and reaches across rows to tend to the garden and for harvesting. So how do we know how far the rows need to be from each other in order to keep each plant 1 foot from the other? To answer that question, we have to go back to high school geometry and use the Pythagorean theorem. Now, for those of you who hate math and are getting ready to turn the video off, don't worry. Before I'm done, I will just show the spacing between rows needed to give equal distances between the plants based on the spacing recommendations for the seeds that you are planting. So just bear with me for a minute. The Pythagorean theorem states that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, where a and b are the sides of a right triangle and c is the hypotenuse. We know that c is 12 inches because that is the distance that we have decided to set between our plants. We also know that a is 6 inches because it is half of the distance of one side of the equilateral triangle. What we don't know is b, which is the distance that one row will need to be from another to keep the plants equal distances apart. Watch this short section again, and again if needed, if this part was difficult to grasp initially, especially if geometry is something of the distant past for you. Now plugging in the numbers, we see that 6 squared plus b squared equals 12 squared, and that ultimately the distance needed is the square root of 108, or 10.392. I just round to the nearest 1/4 inch, which in this case is 10.5 inches. So the distance between rows to maintain 12-inch spacing between the plants is approximately 10.5 inches. Okay, and as promised for the math haters or those who don't want to bother, here are the calculations done for you. You can screenshot this or take a picture of it and use it for later if you want. So, if you want to utilize more of the space that you have to grow more plants while decreasing your garden's water needs and decreasing the amount of time that you spend weeding, consider converting your garden rows into growing beds. I also find it helpful to use heavy mulch, which causes further water retention and decreases weed growth even more. If the Lord is willing, these will be topics for future videos. Thanks for watching.